Emotions are centered in the lower part of the brain.
How was insanity seen in the past? And is modern society making us mentally ill? From the dawn of man to current challenges, including the impact of social media and new psychedelic treatments.
Electroshock therapy may be recommended for other disorders.
Meet the experts in talks about all aspects of mental illness, from historical perspectives to contemporary challenges and future innovations. Welcome to Engelsberg's interviews on mental health, and welcome Rhodri Hayward.
Very pleased to be here, thank you.
You are a reader in history at the Queen Mary University of London.
Correct, yes.
Yes, good. And we're here talking about mental health in all aspects. What is mental health to you?
Well, I mean, that's been a massive question, not just to me, but to generations of psychiatrists and also politicians. I guess a useful working definition is just the ability to flourish in the environment you find yourself in. So you can ask me what I mean by flourish, but we can come on to that later.
Yes, yes. Other branches of medicine have developed around diseases or organs, but psychiatric expertise emerged around a legal category.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm interested in is how psychiatry seems to have become interwoven or imbricated in almost every aspect of our lives. And so I teach a course at Queen Mary, which is a basic history of psychiatry, from the building of the asylums through to their eventual kind of like dismantlement and the emptying of asylums after the 1980s. And one of the things I point out to my students right at the beginning is that psychiatry is an unusual medical specialism. So whereas other medical specialisms tend to grow up around an organ system, like cardiology, or around a specific form of disease, like oncology with cancer, what you see in psychiatry is it's a medical expertise which grows up around a legal question. And that legal question is the question of insanity, whether somebody has responsibility over or agency over their own actions. And so in the British history, I'm very parochial in my teaching, but in the British history, what you tend to see are a group of physicians who begin to appear in the courts and then later begin to develop a kind of like profession around like keeping people who've been safeguarded outside the prison system but can't be let to walk the streets. And those are the people who've been found not guilty but insane in various kind of like legal trials.
No. So how has that affected the view of madness?
Well, I think it means that madness has grown up around a question of threat to a certain extent, and it's taken quite a long time for us to disentangle that association between madness and threat from our lives and from wider politics. But it also means that it's grown up around a question of vulnerability and capacity and who needs help achieving certain things in their lives. So the other area where verdicts of insanity were used and where these things were contested was in things like inheritance. If somebody was seen as not being capable of being an actual inheritor or having the agency to inherit, then things that they would have inherited come under royal prerogative and are safeguarded for them. So it means that we've always had a group of people which we see somehow standing outside our standard ideas of individuality and citizenship. And we've used those people to think about ourselves and to think about what we should be capable of and how we should behave.
But that has changed now, right? I mean, now there's a whole spectrum. I mean, this is where it started, or...
No, I absolutely agree. And so, I mean, one of the interesting things that's happened now is that what started around those legal questions has instead become the materials that we use to make sense of almost every aspect of our lives, from kind of questions about, meaning and what we should be doing with ourselves, to questions about how we interact in the workplace, how we treat our students, how we think about our own physical problems. We tend to often think about them now as maybe symptoms of psychological unrest. So yes, it's quite an imperializing, it's quite an expansive discipline.
And perhaps even on our view on emotions. Or, I mean, how do emotions come into our view of madness? I mean, emotions are part of...
So even in those early legal categorizations of people as being insane or non-compos mentis, one of the things that would allow you to escape responsibility for an action was if you were overcome by what was known as like fury or frenzy. So we've always had this idea that our emotions have the capacity to overturn our wishes or overturn our rationality. And they've always been seen as something threatening. And there's a long Christian tradition, from St. Paul behind that. But I think what's changed is that we've now begun to see emotions both as a key to our flourishing. And so we need to work with our emotions and we need to learn to express them, particularly since Freud and psychoanalysis. We've seen emotions as something that's better let out than kept in. Yeah. So there's been a fairly big turnaround in the 20th century. Mm.
Earlier than that, you write about Edward Oxford.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you remember him?
Well, from my lectures, yes, I do remember him, yeah.
So what about him?
So, Edward Oxford was, he comes up in the early legal history of insanity. And those early judgments around non-compos mentis, about people not being responsible for their actions, in 17th and 18th century law, that have been understood as people just basically not being aware of what we're doing. And one of the tests that was brought in by like Lord Coke and people was that they basically had no more consciousness of their actions when they said than the beasts in the field, than a wild beast. What begins to happen as medical expertise turns up in trials in the early 19th century is that more and more complex actions and more planned actions begin to come under the remit of insanity. And Edward Oxford's case, who was I think he was an 18-year-old barman, who, due to a certain set of delusions, engaged in a long and fairly complicated assassination plot against Queen Victoria. What you saw was somebody who was clearly aware of what he was doing, but unable to actually control his intentions. And so when the trial took place, you had a new understanding being pushed forward of what was called emotional insanity, rather than being seen as something purely cognitive, like based in delusion or based in a kind of lack of grip on reality. It was now based in a kind of like lack of control over ourselves and a lack of control over our own actions.
Did they explain any mechanisms then, when they tried to...
Yeah, so you're beginning to see, about around the same time, yes, you're beginning to see the development of a new kind of psychophysiology around automatic actions, or what we call automatism. And so we, unsurprisingly in Britain at that time, we developed very hierarchical notions of a brain, where the will is seen as what would later be seen as the most evolved part, or the highest nervous center. But we have more kind of like everyday lower nervous centers, which somehow can escape our control. And so what happens in these cases is that our lower nervous centers, which are all about excitement and action and activity, kind of overthrow the master in the house, overthrow the self and personality, and end up causing mischief. So yeah, we've always been very good at using hierarchical models to address our desires and address our own actions.
And looking at the mind as a machine, or...
Yes, to a certain extent, although I think most 19th century investigators would have been unwilling to push purely mechanistic models of our own behavior. So the higher nervous centers are always seen as that point where something like a spiritual will or a soul is interacting with a kind of meaty brain.
But there were some frog legs involved here, weren't they?
Well, yes and no. So one of basically... from the 18th century onwards, what you see is a number of experiments being carried out which show how the body can act without any higher nervous control. And so it was very easy in the 18th century to take a dissected frog's leg and animate it by running a current through it. And so you suddenly had these, and it's the Frankenstein myth.
Yes.
You suddenly have this idea of the body being animated by other sources, not just by the will. And so developing its own agenda.
So it's not a machine, but electricity has a great role here.
The body has a capacity to operate like a machine, yes.
Yeah.
And then you have a whole series of further experiments where with things like with decapitated dogs, which show that like various actions could take place if currents were run through it. So there's quite a lot of neurological research in the middle of the 19th century.
Let's go back to the emotions, which we spoke about. What do you think about emotions? Are they our own?
That's a brilliant question, and it was going to take me a lifetime to answer.
Exactly.
But I would say probably not, because on the one hand, according to contemporary models in evolutionary psychology, there's something we inherit from our primitive forefathers. At another level, there's a kind of new line of research developing around things like extended emotion and extended cognition. There's a sense in which our emotions are very much kind of like tied up with the world around us. So I think it's very difficult these days to think of emotions as somehow neatly fitting in with my idea of myself as an individual. They always extend beyond that.
Yes. And also we've looked at emotions differently. Perhaps we've felt differently throughout the history. So at some times, perhaps emotions among men were seen differently than among women and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one thing that's very clear is that we learn to express ourselves and we learn to feel things quite differently in very short spaces of time. So one of the examples I use when talking to my students is around hysteria. And, hysteria quite famously, when we think about the late 19th century, we have these ideas of Victorian women swooning in the street, of people suddenly becoming paralyzed and unable to use a leg, or maybe coming out of a war situation, being unable to use their eyes for purely psychological reasons. But that model of hysteria, that model of losing control over parts of your body, that expression of hysteria pretty much disappears by the late 1930s, 1940s. When I go into a disco, I don't see women swooning or falling over when they meet me. And I don't think I've ever...
For you.
Yeah, maybe for you, Patrik, but not for me. But so what's happened is we've clearly learned to we still have the same levels of distress, we still have the same levels of unhappiness, but we've learned to embody that and somatically express that in different ways.
Not much has happened, really. I mean, despite everything we know, everything we learn about emotions, about mental health, it seems to be quite even. Or is that your view?
No, because I think when you say even, are you trying to say there's been a lack of progress in mental health?
Yes, exactly.
No, I don't think so, because certainly we have a massive range of interventions, but I think where psychiatry is unlucky is that our capacity for being unhappy is unending, and the complexity of a world that people are dealing with, is always growing, and the materials we have to draw upon to express ourselves or to feel new things are always becoming more complex. And so this experience of doing an interview with you and then seeing a disembodied version of myself talking, years later when I'm an old man is unsettling. And of course, nobody would have experienced that 150 years ago. So we have whole new ways of interacting with ourselves, which are complicated and unpredictable. And, life is an open-ended experiment.
It is, really. And has always been.
Yeah. I think so. But I think there's a sense that the range of materials that we're being exposed to is growing more rapidly than it has been in the past. And so it's just modernity.
Are emotions misunderstood, do you think?
No, probably not. I mean, I'm not sure what would count as a good understanding of them. So I think the way we understand them actually changes them. So you can't disentangle the emotion from the understanding.
It's like a paradox when you know them, or what?
Well, I just think that if, say, every time I feel nervous, I see that as hugely problematic, and I see that as an indication of my failure as a human being, then of course it's going to be reinforced, and that it's going to be expressed much more dramatically, and I'm going to quite quickly find myself caught in a loop. So I think the models of understanding that we have of emotion actually change the way we feel and experience emotion ourselves. Does that make sense? I'm not sure.
It did. So what role does instincts play in this?
Okay, I mean, one of the interesting thing that has happened since the late 19th century, and in particular after the publication of Darwin's The Expression of Emotions in Animal and Man in 1872, is that we've learnt to tell stories about our emotions which sees them as rehearsals of much more kind of like primitive encounters. So Darwin put forward the idea that, how do we explain our emotions? What good is it in evolutionary terms to blush when you see a pretty girl, or to shake, or to like sit like this if I'm being interrogated in an interview? What purpose does that serve? Darwin said, well, a lot of these things are simply vestigial adaptations. They are things we adapted to certain circumstances long ago, which we've since lost. We've lost the circumstances, but the routines have stayed with us. And every time we find ourselves in similar circumstances, we tend to rehearse the reactions of our ancestors. So you still might blush to attract a mate, but it no longer has the same meaning, and it might lose you a mate when you're at the disco instead. And in the same way, I might, retreat like this because I'm getting ready to headbutt you or fight you, but that kind of routine has gone from our lives now. So I think there's a sense since Darwin, and particularly since Freud, that most of our emotions are nostalgic. And I think what's important about that is it's opened up whole new areas of social critique, because we can use our emotions to develop commentaries and statements about what we think is wrong with the world and the way that modernity has developed. And so I think it's very common, both amongst me and my friends and also amongst my students, for everybody to talk about stress, and we all talk about the stress of modern living. But the reason that talking about stress is powerful is because we see it as a contrast to a kind of like more primitive, more free and easy way of existing. And, we now tell a very good story about stress, which was partly developed by Hans Selye back in the 1930s, which is about we've activated systems to fight or flight, and we can't use those systems, and that therefore various hormones which are active in the body end up having pathological consequences, end up kind of like kicking off all kinds of pathological routines. And so we've come to see our emotions as something which needs to be mastered, but we need to master them in order to kind of like adapt them to modernity, which we've never had to do before.
No. And are we good at it?
No, we're not brilliant.
No.
And so one of the news stories that's emerged since the Second World War is our ability to read things like depression in terms of an evolutionary psychological story around social hierarchy. And so when you ask whether we're good at it, one of the things that I think various commentators will point out to you is that, according to the World Health Organization, we've seen like a massive rise in the rate of depression, and it's now the world leading cause of disability. And you might ask why that's happening. And so the evolutionary psychologists put forward a story that we've developed the depression response as a way of opting out of competition and dealing with the problem of social hierarchy. So they argue that in primitive circumstances where you have like every member of a group fighting for social position, fighting to become the top of a pecking order, it was better for the group if certain individuals who'd been defeated didn't come back and carry on fighting, because that wastes everybody's resources, but stepped back and took a kind of retreat response. And depression is seen as that retreat response. And, so on the one hand, we have this data about the huge growth in depression. But for somebody like me, what's interesting about that data, it seems to offer up a social commentary about a world which I think to many of us appears increasingly unequal, and distribution of resources unequal, and with an emphasis on competition when and it seems that emphasis on competition is not good for people at all.
So can actually this make us talk about the important things, not the symptoms of an unequal world, but actually that the world is unequal? Does these mental health issues make us talk about the world?
I think what's important about psychiatry in the way it's developing now, it provides us a bridge for thinking about our inner lives and the world around us. And so it's given us a very powerful set of tools and narratives for kind of like connecting what's going on in our, day to day in a world or in our feelings with making judgments around the kind of political organisation or the economic organisation of a world about us. So I think it's an interesting moment. And we've seen a lot of talk from governments, less so recently, but certainly before the financial crash in 2008, a lot of talk around embracing a happiness agenda, which has gone away. But I do think we should be thinking about psychiatry in making political decisions. And psychiatric evidence should be one level of evidence that's involved in developing policy.
So it started with the law, and it ended up in politics.
Yeah, which is, you could argue, is the same place. I mean, that's where the law starts. But I think it's a useful kind of pigeon. It's a useful way of moving between medicine and politics. And I think those two can't be disentangled anyway.
No. So this day we talk about mental health and diagnosis.
Yeah.
Would you put a diagnosis on yourself?
No, and I wouldn't advise you doing that either, Patrik, because
I'm a journalist. So I wouldn't like to.
I mean, sometimes they're useful. And of course, everybody can identify various neuroses in themselves, and sometimes they help you to get access to resources that you might need to negotiate a situation. But I'm too old and too tired to develop a new diagnosis for myself and try to reorganise my life around it.
Sounds reassuring.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rhodri Hayward.
Thank you, Patrik.